I'm Jeff. I'm actually an employee of Isovalent. And I, like the ribbon says, I am less than 3 metrics. So I am low cardinality and probably trendable. Oh wait, I love metrics. Sorry, bad joke. Bad joke. So, right, let's get into it. I think everyone in this room knows what the problem is, but this is being recorded. I'm going to do a little bit of remedial work here. The problem is high metric cardinality burns money, right? It burns compute, it burns storage, it burns network, that's all money, and it's not necessarily clear that everyone's extracting value from the cardinality that they are collecting and saving. In this talk, I'm going to be talking specifically about Prometheus metrics because I think across the landscape, that's now sort of the de facto standard in how a lot of people collect metrics, especially in Kubernetes clusters, which is where I'm coming from. But of course, this applies to other time series database too, to some extent across the board. Every time series database has problems at different scales. So, but right now I'm just going to talk about the open source implementation as a reference and some strategies around that. So, real quick, remedial. Cardinality is basically defined as the unique set of things that you associate with each metric. In Prometheus, this shows up as labels that you attach to metrics families. And then, every time you add a new label value, you're basically creating a new metric line that you have to scrape. So this is a simple example from the default Golang SDK that you spin up when you do the hello world example. And then, if you're trying to track 10 statuses with 5 methods, you quickly get up to 50 lines. So your cardinality grows quite quickly as your dimensionality of the labels grow, right? And that's cardinality in a nutshell. You add more labels, you add more problems. On the pro side, you get more context, you get more granularity that you can expose in things like your dashboards. The downsides is that means more lines to scrape. Your time series have to end up holding more information in memory as they're scraping that. And then in the back end, it slows down your queries because you're building more things to index. So why am I up here talking to you about this? I'm not an SRE. I am not a practitioner in your field. I'm actually a community advocate. I'm like a DevRel for Isovalent, right? And I work in association with the Cilium project. I hope a lot of people know what Cilium is. In fact, it's a CNCF project that Isovalent donated to CNCF, and it's really about networking using eBPF. And most likely, the people, your coworkers and your companies who really care about Cilium are actually at KubeCon Paris right now, talking to like 90% of my company. So I'm actually here. So I'm actually going to throw our project under the bus a little bit and talk about a problem I think that's a little more industry-wide that doesn't just affect SREs, but now it affects people like your infrastructure platform team who are operating clusters and dealing with metrics in a whole different way. So my motivation is specifically Cilium Hubble. It's the observability tool that's part of the Cilium project. And internally, it actually has these great little things they call flow events, which are structured logs, right? They work great. The observability tool works great. This is not going to be a product pitch or a project pitch. I'll happily talk about that later when I'm consuming a couple of drinks at the reception if you really want to talk about it. What I want to talk about is the high cardinality metrics that are optionally exposed by Hubble to integrate on user demand with existing dashboard solutions. And those can be problematic. So Hubble metrics can introduce context labels. Like there's a lot of context associated with how containers talk to each other, how the pods in Kubernetes talk to each other. And Cilium is able to make use of that to do its work and exposes that as an observability tool in Hubble. But Prometheus metrics don't come with that context, right? So Hubble gives you the option to layer some of that context into your metrics so then you can do interesting queries and cross-references in your dashboard, right? So here's a quick example of just one metric with none of the context. It has 125 possible label values in 3 labels, right? So it's a maximum of about 125 lines that you have to scrape if everything's populated, right? But then we get into the best well-behaved context labels that Hubble exposes, like protocol and traffic direction. And now we're up to like 2,500 possible lines that you're going to scrape. That's actually reasonable. What's not reasonable is when you get into string-like label values, right? These things have extreme amounts of cardinality to them. And in the Hubble metric space specifically, we expose things like source IP and destination IP for the traffic between pods. So on one node in Kubernetes, you're allowed, documented, to have 256 pods in one node, right? That's a possible 2 to the 16 lines to scrape if every pod's talking to every other pod in that one node. It's never that bad, but across your entire cluster, you could easily have 256 different pods across 10 different nodes talking to 256 different pods. So you can get to that level of cardinality in your cluster really quickly if you are doing microservice things that have a lot of scale and replication. So that's not good. And then there's things like the source IP, which are just, not source IP, I mean like the namespace and workload. Some of the more freeform strings, I don't even know how to talk about that as a cardinality because that's so dynamic. And it gets weirder. Like we actually expose trace IDs. I think Charity mentioned trace IDs this morning too. And if you expose trace IDs, which are uniques, right? That gets very high cardinality very fast, and it's unfathomable to me. So that's a problem. Applications like us are part of the problem. Like we are exposing these metrics to you to consume, and then what do you do with them, right? And I'm here to say maybe we need to stop doing this, or at least give users some strategies on how to handle this so that they're not being consumed by resource burn they're not getting value out of. Like I said, maybe not everything needs to be a metric. I think this picks up on a theme that Charity spoke to about observability 2.0. Hubble already is using structured logs, and I think the product uses ClickHouse specifically exactly because of this, right? It's not metrics, it's structured logs, and we're going to expose all of that context, all of that granularity, all that cardinality in a different way than a time series database. So, and I want to point out, none of this is enabled by default by Cilium because the project knows there's pain here, and we expect users who need it to turn this on and know what they're doing. And users are part of the problem too, because my understanding is this is exposed specifically as a request from users who want to integrate into their existing dashboards and other monitoring infrastructure. And I mean, it's not a good pattern, but it's the pattern you guys are using, and so applications have to support it. And I can say this as an external application, like as a CNCF project, right? I can throw my project under the bus a little bit, but it's got to be like that for your internal apps too, to some extent, right? Like we can't just be unique here in terms of exposing this because users are asking for it to be exposed. So why specifically do users of Hubble like these? Well, these are great context for diagnosing active network policy problems in Kubernetes, because a network policy basically works as an internal cluster firewall. You can basically say, I don't want these sets of pods with these labels talking to these sets, or I want to make sure these can. So it gives you some policy control inside your cluster so that pods that shouldn't be talking to each other aren't, right? So it's great until you misconfigure it, and then how do you diagnose that, right? Because it's going to show up in some of your other metrics as just failed request, right? It's not the applications team's fault, it's your infrastructure policy's fault, and so this really lets you dive into that and see specifically where that's failed. And so there is value here, but it's on really short timescales. Like this stabilizes very quickly after you've made a change. You're going to see this be a problem, you're going to diagnose it, and you're going to fix it, right? But these aren't anything like golden signals that you can trend. So, like I said, I'm here from the application side, it's like, I think we need to do a better job developing strategies that we expect users to know how to use to handle high cardinality, to get value out of it. Right now, we sort of hide it behind option flags, and we go, well, it's not our job to solve this problem. Like, the users should know when they turn this on that it has impacts. And I don't think that's true. I think it's too easy, especially from Prometheus. Like, once you turn on all the labels, you can scrape all the things and run yourself into a problem very quickly in terms of, I don't know why I went from $3 to $1 million in observability spend in like 3 hours. I'm being a little flippant, but it's the problem, right? So I'm here to talk about strategies, right? So initial part of this is basically, I mean, users have to really ask themselves questions about how they're going to use these metrics. Like, what's the scope? Like, for Hubble metrics specifically, and we're maybe unique in this regard, we're very instantaneous, right? There is a fire right now, and you're going to want to look at this to diagnose the config and get over it. It's not going to be something that you trend. But a lot of metrics that are trendable, you probably aren't using all the cardinality that you are trending, right? You're probably rolling them up into some sort of aggregate. That's what you really care about. So do you need the cardinality? Like, you may, and you have to ask these questions for the metric family and for the individual labels you're adding, right? Is the metric family valuable and over what timescales? Is the label valuable and over what timescales? So, if the metric family isn't valuable to you, don't collect it. Like, we fall into this trap, and I think Daniel talked about this in the last talk in his Ticking Time Bomb talk. Measure what you value. Don't fall in the trap of valuing what you can measure, right? Make sure that you can defend the metrics you're collecting as having value, right? Because we're all getting squeezed now in terms of making sure that we're not just collecting information that has no value to us. And this can get hard now because there are tools that, AI is a thing, and there are tools that want to consume all these metrics and give you insights. I'm not going to make an opinion about that. But you may not have to hold that information for a very long time. You have to evaluate what your needs are. So you maybe need to collect it, but maybe you can throw it away within a day. So, is the metric value instantaneous? Like, is it operational feedback? Like, right now you're solving a problem. Right now this is diagnostic. Or is it trendable, right? And so I think as SREs, I think you're probably more used to using metrics as trendable information. But clearly, based on what I'm seeing in the people try to use Hubble from the infrastructure team side, they may not understand that that's the intent. Like, there's a lot of high cardinality that's only useful right now, and you're never going to want to collect it and hold it for a year. So, talking about timescales, like, not every metric needs to be held for the exact same amount of time to get the value out of it. Some of these things you will want to hold forever, and some of these things you only need for a week or two, right? So that's not something I can tell you as part of a strategy. That's something you have to evaluate as you go through and think about your infrastructure. So in my opinion, I actually think, and this I think coincides with what Charity was saying this morning, I think high cardinality metrics actually tend to quickly lose value over time. I actually think structured logs hold their value over a long time scale. But I think metrics, you get the most value out of metrics, or at least the cardinality of metrics, very quickly. And then as you hold metrics longer, the value goes down. So that ties into the strategies I'm going to talk about right now. And like I said in the middle here, I really do think there's a lot of value, and if we can get to structured logs as sort of single source of truth, that's a huge win. I don't know how to do it. So strategies. So these are the things I think you should be doing if you have evaluated that you're going to have high cardinality metrics somewhere, somehow. Well, strategy one, well, like I said, stop using metrics altogether. That's a new slide I added today because I heard the talk this morning. I don't think we can be realistic and actually do that, but I would love to. Strategy one, have infinite money and carbon credits. That's where I think everyone sort of agrees that's where we were for 3 years. In terms of money, now that's ending. I actually think there's a bigger problem showing up. The carbon credit stuff, legislation that Europe is sort of championing is going to really squeeze observability in a different way than just cache. It'll show up sort of as cache, but it's going to be different. And that's also not realistic now, right? So strategy 2, you really have to start implementing some sort of tiered metric infrastructure. And you have to think in terms of a cardinality budget so that you can make sure that you're only keeping cardinality over the timescales that matter to you. And then as you go to longer and longer timescales, you drop more and more of that cardinality, right? And one note, I don't know the whole space. I do know that there are other time series databases that are compatible with Prometheus metrics that actually offer the ability to have different retention times for different metrics families. That's super useful in terms of your infrastructure design if you can get it, because it makes it a lot easier in how you structure infrastructure to make sure you can do this. So strategy 3 builds on that. You basically want to use some sort of aggregating rules so that you are moving data through your tiers of collection and over the timescales so that you are moving your cardinality down as you increase the retention time. And strategy 4, scope as much of your operational cardinality in situ in your clusters. And I'm speaking from a Kubernetes cluster perspective, obviously, right? This is where that's what my day job project is all about, Kubernetes. So the idea is that you can hold on to your really high cardinality that you need in situ and only keep it for like a day, right? And then use something like a streaming aggregate processor. M3 is one of them. In fact, this morning I was down in the showroom downstairs, and one of the vendors actually called my title out and challenged me on this because they say they have a product specifically meant for high cardinality. I believe it was Last9 is the vendor that challenged me on this. So shout out to them for actually calling me out this morning and saying that they're part of the solution. So I think that's a big part of it, is that if you can, another way to aggregate, right, is to stream out using a stream processor so it never actually hits a database in between so that you're not having to do those aggregate recording rules, which are also have an expense to them. So I think that's it. I'm actually at 2 minutes on the clock. So I just want to recap. I do love metrics, but I hate seeing them abused. And I think we've gotten to a pattern, I know, where there's an expectation that we're using them in a way that is not a good use of resources. So, high cardinality metrics really aren't good candidates for golden signals and sort of a SLO, SLA point of view. There's just a few things I think that form the basis of a strategy for users, especially the users in your workplaces that aren't SREs. Like I said, like my customers for my company are now like platform teams and network ops, as software eats the network stack, the networking stack, and they need to have strategies too. And I think you guys can help inform those other groups about the way to use metrics appropriately versus structured logs. So I think that's it. Thank you, everybody, for coming to my talk. And I'd love to have longer conversations with people with a drink in hand later, so we can really talk specifics about strategies if there's something I'm missing or if I've gotten something wrong.